right. I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brittany Robert. I'm here from Twill, and I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith, our webinar panelist for this month for our session today about 7 types of rest to fight fatigue. Fatigue and sleep is one of our main skills here at Twill, so we're really excited to learn about different ways to boost our sleep, get better rest, and everything in between. As just a general admin before I hand it over to Dr. Dalton-Smith, the chat is open for sort of anything, any commentary throughout the presentation, but any questions that you want Dr. Dalton-Smith to actually address, please pop them in the Q&A and we will handle those at the end. So questions for Dr. Dalton-Smith, put them in the Q&A and then feel free to sort of chat in the chat. And we will be kind of checking in there and seeing the feedback. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Dalton-Smith.
Thanks, Brittany. Hi, everyone. Excited to get a chance to share with you a little bit about the work that I do, specifically around the different types of rest we need to feel restored, energized, and to help overcome burnout and fatigue. And so I want to start by just kind of giving you a little bit of framework, because I think sometimes when we think about rest, we automatically start thinking about sleeping, we start thinking about napping, we start thinking about what we do on some Saturdays where we just kind of sit around and binge watch Netflix or just kind of lay around and do nothing. Rest does include cessation activities, but I think we need to really get a much broader idea of what rest can mean in our lives. And I feel like that is the reason so many of us stay tired, because we either assume rest and sleep are the same thing, or we only look at rest as cessation activities, stopping. But in reality, rest has many different components to it. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes with you diving into that part of my work. And then we're going to spend some, probably about 15 minutes at the end to answer any questions you have and just to kind of get some feedback. So let's take a look at initially when we think about rest, and even before we get to rest, when we start talking about how do we manage stress, I got to say that's probably one of my biggest pet peeves. I don't think we can manage stress. Stress are the changes, the challenges, all those things that pop up in our lives. And so when we talk about stress management, which we've been doing for many years and have not been successful at, the reason is you cannot manage change and challenge. You can't take change and challenge out of the equation. It's always there. It's always coming. There's always new things to adapt to. But what you do have control over is how you respond to the changes and challenges, how you recover from them. That is what rest is. It's those restorative activities, that recovery period that comes that helps you to be able to build inner strength, to grow, and to build the resilience that you desire. So the stress and challenges, those you don't really get much control over. The restorative process, the rest, that is actually the part that we have the most ability to begin to implement changes, to be able to see an improvement in these areas. And so this is where my work is based around, looking at how do we restore? How do we pour back into the places where we have become depleted? How do we improve our personal rest deficits? Well, I think it begins by first evaluating what are the different types of rest that are available to you. What are the different ways that you can expend energy throughout your day, that you can become depleted and drained? What are the different areas of your life that can become burned out that can then also be restored if you're very intentional about getting the rest and the activities that you need to pour back in? So the 7 areas that came out of that research were the mental, spiritual, emotional, social, sensory, creative, and physical. And so we're going to go through each one of these. I'm going to spend a little bit of time sharing with you what a rest deficit could look like if you have one in any of these areas, as well as taking a look at what are some of the restorative practices that you can begin to incorporate in the middle of your busy life, not having to take a sabbatical or figure out how to carve out, 4 hours a day or a whole day a week to be able to incorporate these things. But you can start layering them into some of your current practices and habits so that you can make rest a natural part of your rhythm. A work-rest rhythm is what I call it, so that you are having ebbs and flow of when you're using energy as well as when you are restoring energy. So before we jump into that, I want us to see just where we're at as it relates to sleep. As Brittany mentioned, with sleep being such an important aspect of it, we're going to take a moment to do a couple of polls throughout the time together. And our first one is just to look at how much sleep are you actually getting most nights. So if we could get that poll popped up, and let's see where we all stand just to begin. You have about 65% of you that have answered. Once we hit somewhere over 75, Brittany, we can show the results. And so as it stands right now, most of you are getting somewhere between 5 to 8, with the majority of you getting pretty close to 51%. And so getting 51%, getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep. You know, the thing that I found is this, which is excellent. That's kind of where statistically we're wanting most people to be, 7+ or so hours of sleep. A few of you are getting less than 4, which honestly, you have to be tired to some degree or fatigued at some level just because there's a level of sleep deprivation. But what I'm finding is when we have these periods where people are not getting adequate amounts of sleep, they're tired. And so they assume they just need more sleep. On the contrary, when people are getting adequate sleep and they go to bed and they wake up the next morning still exhausted, that can even be sometimes even more of a desperate situation, because then what is the cure for fatigue if it's not sleep? Well, that's why I say sleep and rest are not the same things. Rest is actually the bridge, is sometimes the precursor to being able to get higher quality, deeper, more restful sleep. Because if your mind's active and you have a mental rest deficit, or your body's achy because you have a physical rest deficit, or your emotions are all over the place because you have an emotional rest deficit, you can imagine it's going to be very difficult to then get better sleep, because you have these rest deficits that are then keeping you from the sleep that you desire, keeping you from the stage 3 and 4 non-REM restorative type sleep that actually helps you to wake up feeling ready to start your day. So let's begin with physical rest. When we think about physical rest, we have to get beyond the thought of just sleep. Sleep is important, but sleep is primarily a type of passive physical rest, along with napping. And then we have to start thinking about what are the active forms of physical rest that actually help our bodies feel relaxed, that actually help us to be able to have our muscles feel tense and relaxed and help our circulation. So the active component of physical rest includes things like yoga, stretching, foam rollers, using massage therapy, things like leisure walks, basically anything that helps your body feel better. It also includes the body ergonomics of your workstation. And so taking into account the chair that you sit in, how your computer monitor hits your body and how it affects your neck and your posture, looking at all of the different aspects of how your body is used throughout the day, and then evaluating, are there times that you are expending energy with your body that you are not allowing opportunities for restoration, for relaxation of the body itself? Because a tight, tense body is going to have a much harder time going to sleep than a body that's in a relaxed muscular state. And so that's just the beginning. That's just physical. And so if you're thinking about sleep as being your primary source of physical rest, or just stopping the body, we've only hit 1 out of the 7. Focusing on just physical rest eliminates 6 other areas that could be the place where you have your greatest rest deficit. This is why sometimes simply stopping and taking time away to just do nothing isn't making you feel any better, because you may not be actually addressing the area of your personal rest deficit. So let's take a look at a couple of others. Mental rest is one that we find that many people struggle with. And we have an assessment at this time that over 250,000 people have taken at restquiz.com. The assessment helps people to evaluate which of the 7 types of rest that they have a higher level of rest deficit in. And consistently, mental rest deficits tend to run very high across the board and across countries. And what we're finding is this: If I define it to you and share kind of what it looks like in real life, most people start getting it. So let me give you an example of someone who has a mental rest deficit. If you've ever had an experience where you lay down in bed and physically you feel exhausted, you feel tired, and you think I should drop right off to sleep. However, after lying in that bed for like 5 minutes, you realize that your brain doesn't really want to turn off. You're thinking all the thoughts, you're over processing, you're running through your to-do list for the next day. You may even be recounting conversations that you had with a colleague or with your spouse, and your brain won't turn off. Or maybe you're someone who you walk into a room and you're thinking, why am I in here? I know I came in here for something, but I don't know why I'm in this room anymore. Or maybe you walked into a store, you had a list of 3 items that you were going to pick up. And so you remember the first 2 items, but you just can't seem to remember that 3rd item. And you're young, you don't have dementia. There's no underlying reasons that you can medically that you can describe why you should be so forgetful and why you can't concentrate. These can all be signs of a mental rest deficit. Now, understand that I said, barring any other medical problems. So with all of these rest deficits, yes, absolutely. I'm an internal medicine physician by practice, in clinical practice. So I have a high respect for the need to make sure that you don't have any underlying medical conditions. But what I found was many of my patients had no underlying medical conditions and were still exhausted. And the changes that they needed were not another pill or not another test. What they needed were to evaluate what they were doing as restorative practices in their lives. And so in the area of mental rest, we're looking at those things that actually help you clear your mental space, that help you concentrate, that help you be able to remove that extra cerebral noise that many of us have. Now, I'm going to share a couple of things that can add to a mental rest deficit and a few things that can help improve it. In the chat, just share with me, let's have a moment of honesty. If most of you were looking at your computer screens and counting the number of windows or tabs that you have open, put in the chat how many are open for you on a typical day. Is it 1, 2? I do this with companies across the world, and I've gotten everything from, 2 to 3 for maybe a group of people who don't use computers very much, to up to 50 with some tech companies where multiple windows are open. They're processing through multiple different screens. This is the thing about that. Multitasking has actually trained our brains to be able to jump from a lot of information without actually having to concentrate and fully consume the information that's presented in front of us. And so you can imagine if you have 5 or 10 screens open, you haven't taken any opportunity to even fully evaluate what's on each different screen. You know that the screen's open, so when you need the information, you click in the window and go right back there. Well, when you walk into that store and you're trying to remember those 3 items and you're like, why can't I remember 3 things? Well, your brain's like, click the screen that has that information because it's not here. We've trained our brain not to concentrate, not to retain information. And then we decide that we wanted to call on that information at will. Not happening. So that's why it seems like sometimes that we just can't seem to have the level of concentration and clarity we did in the past because we really trained our brains in the opposite way. Now, on the flip side of that, when you're lying in bed and you're ruminating over information, you're ruminating over that argument you had with your spouse or that disagreement you had with your coworker or that to-do list that you just don't want to forget to do that one thing tomorrow at work, that rumination process is actually telling the brain, this is something I want to remember, because rumination is what we did in school when we were teenagers trying to learn a topic. You ruminated over the information. We call it studying it. And that rumination locked it into our brain. Well, when you're ruminating over things like your to-do list, your brain recognizes that that's something you want to hold on to. And it will hold on to that information even at the expense of you sleeping. So how do you resolve that? Well, a simple strategy that many people use is called a brain dump. And it's simply this. You have a notepad, a piece of paper, Post-it note, you choose what you want to use, but you have something near your bed that you jot down whatever it is that your brain is ruminating over. Write down whatever it is on that to-do list. Write down whatever whatever that conversation stirred up in you. Write whatever that is down so that you can now release it onto something concrete that then gives your brain permission to release it, because it no longer feels it has the responsibility of retaining that bit of information for you. How do you regain your ability to memorize things and to be able to have mental clarity faster? Decreasing the amount of multitasking that you're doing. This can be something as simple as doing what we call time blocking, having specific periods of time where you're going to go in really focused on a specific area of work that you're doing and not allow yourself to be scattered, to jump from information to information. If you're working on a project, have a time block for whatever that project is so that your attention is focused in on getting that project done. Send a memo out to your team or to your coworkers and say, hey, for the next 90 minutes, I'm going to be locked in on this project, which then means they don't expect you to answer your emails, go back and forth between teams or whatever it is, because all of those distractions are just taking you in and out of mental clarity, making it harder for you to actually be able to concentrate and do deep work, and further exhausting you mentally, because every time you are pulled out of the focused work you're doing, you then have to build back up the energy to be able to go back in at the same level. The next type of rest we're going to take a look at is something called sensory rest. Now, sensory rest takes into account the sensory inputs in your environment. Now, I have a cell phone up here because this is probably one of the number one culprits that most of us get in trouble with sensory rest, but it's so much more than that. So let's backtrack just a little bit before we hit on our cell phones. Think about your workplace environment. What are the lights, sounds, smells, tactile experiences in your work situation? This is whether you're going into an office or you're in a hybrid situation or working from a remote home office. What are you hearing? If you're from home, are you hearing kids in the background that are, doing their own things? So you hear the hum of laughter and play. If you're at the office, maybe you're hearing phones ringing. Maybe you're seated by the elevator and you're hearing the dinging of the elevator going on and off. Or maybe you're having multiple Zoom meetings. And so you're in these spaces where your sensories are overloaded because you're looking at all the different boxes on the Zoom. Regardless, we have to understand that sensory overload drains us. And in that process, it oftentimes results in us either becoming irritated, agitated, or developing rage or anger. I'll give you an example of this that might be a little easier to be able to understand. If you've ever had a 2 or 3 year old and you take them to a birthday party and they're like in the perfect mood, they're super happy, they have no problems, right? And then somewhere about an hour into that birthday party, they're screaming their head off and nobody took their toy, nobody took their cake away, nobody said they had to share. They're just screaming. They're just having a temper tantrum. That is what sensory overload looks like. Too much of a good thing coming at once, and it's just too much for the system to handle. Well, when you're an adult, you learn how to not have the temper tantrum most of the time. But what it usually does happen is you might find that you're a very irritable person after a certain period of day. And you're like, why am I so agitated by the time this occurs? You notice that road rage ramps up in the evening compared to in the morning. Sensory overload. We've already had a day full of sensory overwhelm, and now I have to get behind the car in traffic. Sometimes it just seems like too much. So let's start thinking of ways to downgrade your sensory input throughout your day. You really can't get rid of all of the sensory input unless you're going to get in a sensory deprivation tank, which honestly, I don't recommend for most people because it's quite a shock to the system. But you can downgrade sensory input in your day. It could be something as simple as, if we're talking about that Zoom meeting, if you think about a normal meeting, we would all be in the same room together. Even right now, we would all be, in a conference room somewhere, in an auditorium, having this conversation, all 200 of us. And so if we did that, And then we would all have the same experience. Well, now if I put together all of your little boxes, inside of Zoom, I'm looking at so many different inputs. Every office space looks different. Every bedroom or living room looks different. I'm looking at your bookshelves and all these things when we have these multiple different screens. In your workspaces, consider having a universal virtual screen background that you're going to use throughout your company. Everybody has the same background. It removes the excessive sensory input of every single room having a different view to it. And on top of that, you can click specifically to only be focusing on the one person who's speaking to further downgrade the amount of sensory input that you're viewing. If you notice that seems to be overwhelming to you, small tricks to try to change it just a little bit so that you can begin to start noticing a change. If you're in your office space or your home office and you're hearing all the noise that's going around, maybe carving out certain periods of the day when you're using some noise cancellation earphones. Just a moment to block out some of the sensory input. Very helpful also if you do a lot of traveling, because planes tend to be very noisy. And then just having those noise cancellation earphones in, you don't have to play any music. You don't have to have any additional sound. You just are blocking out that extra sensory input from the outside. Now for the cell phones. Cell phones, for most of us, drive sensory input to us, especially if you have your notifications set very high. So I want you to start thinking about when you get your notifications, is that notification one that you really need in the moment that they sent it? If it is not, consider turning off notifications for that specific app. Now, I do realize, having worked with so many different companies and so many different industries, I do realize that there are some industries where you do need certain apps to be able to stay on your phone or on your computer. So have those if necessary, downgrade and turn off all others that are not necessary. For most people, you really only need your actual phone, and then you only need the text message as the primary notifications that you're receiving. Most of us can turn off all other notifications, including your social media notifications, your weather, your news, all of those different notifications. Now, notice I didn't say take them off of your phone or remove the app. You want the app. Let's be realistic. We want the access. But should the app have the ability to push you stress at its discretion? It should not. We should be able to have control over when we're receiving certain bits of information. You cannot time block social media if social media is pushing you notifications at its discretion. You can't time block your consumption of news if it's pushing information to you. So you want to be able to evaluate how certain things cause you to feel, how they affect your energy level, and then start taking back some level of control, keeping the access, however, with the control. The problem with this is notifications do so much more than just push us the cortisol release. It reinforces the dopamine receptors. So we tend to have a desire to look at the phone even when we don't want to look at the phone. There's this like pull. Have you ever tried to not use your device? It's almost painful to not look at it. So for some of you, you may even have to do a bit of an electronic detox to even get to the place where you cannot be pulled to your devices because of that. And so you don't have to turn off all the notifications today. Start with a process. Maybe start with social media, then the weather, then the news, and downgrading some of those sensory inputs so you can downgrade some of the sensory overload that your body's been experiencing. Now, the next two types of rest we're going to take a look at are spiritual and creative. Now, spiritual rest, I don't spend an excessive amount of time on. It's very different across the board, depending on your own faith belief systems and your own way of evaluating spirituality. But at the very core of spiritual rest for everyone is that need that we all have to feel as if we belong, as if we're accepted, as if our lives have purpose and we're getting back into the greater good. That interconnectivity of humanity is at the very core of spiritual rest, regardless of what your faith belief system is. And so if you are a person that have a faith system, then you may find a lot of comfort and specific evaluations of ways of getting spiritual rest throughout that faith system. Or you may be someone who finds spiritual rest more in other forms of community, such as causes maybe that you believe in, or things that you actually feel that community and connectivity with, places where you experience that. But for each of us, we need to evaluate that for ourselves and enter into spiritual rest at your own level of acceptance. The next is creative rest. Now, with creative rest, that was one that there was so little research on, but most of us had already experienced it. We just didn't know what we were experiencing, and we didn't know even if it was something worthy of our time and our effort. I'll give you an example. Take a look at this. Now, when we started looking at the research surrounding around creative rest, what we found is that over 60% of people said that they found a sense of restoration, a sense of peace, of calm, of tranquility around bodies of water. That is what creative rest is. Creative rest is the rest we experience, that renewal we experience when we allow ourselves to appreciate beauty in whatever form, whether that's natural beauty like the ocean and the mountains and the trees and flowers, or created beauty like art or music or theater or dance. You get to choose what types of beauty inspire you. But creative rest is the rest that comes when we allow ourselves to feel that inspiration, that awe and wonder, when we allow beauty to create something inside of us, to awaken something inside of us. Now, I'm oftentimes asked, so is it creative rest when I go to that wine bar and we are, doing pottery together, as, we get our group together, we're doing pottery or we're painting together. Is that creative rest? No, that's actually creative work, because you're putting a demand on your creativity to do something. Creative rest is when you're appreciating what has already been created and allowing it to create something inside of you. Now, we are going to talk about that pottery and art class because it does have benefit, and we're going to get to it next. But before we get there, I want us to take a poll to evaluate creative rest for ourselves. What's your favorite way of experiencing creative rest? So the poll has a few different options. However, I do realize there are an endless number of options on how you can get creative rest. So if you don't see your favorite thing here, please type it into the chat, because I can guarantee you someone is like, yeah, I want to know some other ways I can get this, because most of us are expending so much creative energy and we've never even thought about restoring that part of ourselves. Creative energy is so much more than if you're a musician or you're an artist or you're a painter or a researcher like I am. It's so much more than that. Creative rest is needed if you're someone who ever solves problems, which I think is all of us. If you're having to figure out how to get one of your children to ballet and the other one to baseball, you're using creative energy to figure that schedule out. If you're having to be innovative at your job, you're using creative energy. If you're in marketing and sales, every conversation is an act of creative energy. There's so much creative energy expended in our world, and such a lack of respect for our own need for creative rest to pour back into that bucket that is consistently being drained. So love that over 43% of you, let's see, we're at 74%, so we can end the poll. I love that over 43% of you said that natural settings were how you're experiencing creative rest. Of that, about 28% said bodies of water as well. And then we had music coming up next, and 5% of you put something over into the chat. So be sure to check that out and see what others are using for creative rest. Some of my favorite ones that I've heard as far as other ways of experiencing creative rest is pet therapy. Those times of just being with your furry friend and enjoying the creative nature of animals and being around them. And so many different ways of experiencing them, but it's important. It's important to our own ability to continue to pour out at a high level within our careers and within the places where we are equipped to show up into the world in a way that is effective. And it keeps us from burning out and feeling drained. So the next two types of rest we're going to take a look at are emotional rest and social rest. And these are the last two. And I want to start with emotional rest because I feel sometimes when we think about emotional rest, we don't really see all the different possibilities of how it can look. And so at the very core of what emotional rest is that ability, it's the need really that we have where we want to be able to really just be honest with how we're feeling, to be authentic, to express ourselves without being censored, without fear of being canceled in your own home or not feeling like you can just say things as they are. And so I'll give an example of this because sometimes it's easier to think about it in different ways. I'll give a couple of examples, actually. This is the one that I probably struggled with the most as an internal medicine physician. My clinical practice is set up in such a way that I see my patients in the office, but I also see them when they're in the ER and the ICU. And so, it's not like I'm just showing up as the first time I'm seeing them is when they're in an emergency setting. These are people I know. So I know the dog's name. I've seen the grandbaby pictures, it's like, it's personal to me. These people are people that I care about. They're not just the chart that I picked up today because this is my shift. And so when we're in a life or death type situation, and I'm at that ICU bedside and we're at an end of life time, I can't just turn my emotions off. However, I'm a professional enough to not burst into tears, even if that's the emotion that I'm feeling. I can lock that down and block it completely out and do the work that I need to do because I know that expressing those emotions in that moment would not serve my patient, the patient's family, or my nursing staff. And so I put it on lockdown and I do what I need to do professionally. However, at some point in time, I have to deal with that. That's the reason why many high stress professions end up in suicide because we never deal with that emotional stuff that we just learn how to block away. Blocking it away doesn't heal it. It just keeps it festering until it boils over. Another situation that you may have noticed, if you do any flights and you've ever seen that flight attendant who is dealing with someone who, quite frankly, is just being a jerk. They've had too much to drink and they're demanding, and you're like, you want to tell the person off. But you watch this flight attendant keep a smile on their face and they go about their day, and you know that they're fuming on the inside, but professionalism demands they keep it together. Emotional rest deficits occur in those situations. Now, I've given you two completely different extremes, but I can guarantee you in your own life, you're doing some level of emotional labor, is what I call this. It's the heavy lifting of emotion. You do this when something's going on in your home or your finances or your health, and you keep it in, you don't share it with your kids, your parents, your spouse, whoever it is that you don't want to burden them with the extra stress of your emotional stuff. So you carry the emotional labor of keeping all of that together and keeping it in and blocking it in. That leads to an emotional rest deficit. It's the same thing when we talk about compassion fatigue, forms of emotional rest deficit. When we think about vicarious trauma, you're working with people who have been traumatized, and then it's like you experience some of the same trauma vicariously, emotional rest deficit. It's all coming from the same place. We take our professionalism to a point where we feel as if it is never safe or appropriate to be fully authentic and release our own emotions. Every one of us needs somebody in our life or a situation in our life where we have the ability and the freedom to release our emotions. Now, that could be with a person like a therapist, a counselor, a trusted friend, a pastor. You get to pick your emotional rest person. That's your option. Or you can get emotional rest through, if you don't have that person, you can get emotional rest through art expression. That's why I'm always happy when friends want to get together and go and create art together somewhere, whether that's the wine and painting, type thing, or maybe you write poetry in your private time, or maybe you do music, you create your own music. Those are also forms of emotional rest. And this is why you feel the freedom to express what is inside of you through art. So that is how some people experience emotional rest. Another way you could get emotional rest, if you don't want to talk to people, is through journaling. You have a place where you feel it's safe to release those emotions. So I'm not judging how you get the emotional rest. It's different for every single one of us, but every one of us needs a place where we can release it, where we feel like it is safe and appropriate to release what we're feeling in a way that it allows us to not have to carry the emotional labor of that all the time. Now, the last type of rest we're going to look at is social rest. And social rest really deals with the people in our lives that we feel we can receive from. So when you think about social rest, think about it this way. Looking at the people in your life, kind of put them into two camps, so to speak. Who are the people who, you spend most of your time with, you're using most of your energy with? These are the people who are draining your social energy. Now, it doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means the nature of the relationship is such that you're usually in giving mode. So this could be your family. This could be your elderly parents. This could be your clients, your coworkers, your colleagues, wherever it is you're serving and doing and giving. Those people are draining your social energy. Now think about who are the people in your life who don't need anything from you. You just enjoy being around them. They enjoy being around you. They're life-giving. They pour back into you. They're people who you leave feeling restored and energized when you're around, and you don't leave feeling like they just drain the life right out of you. Now, your family and your kids can be both. They can pull you from your social energy as well as pour back into your social energy. But you do have to be careful and mindful of that, because oftentimes those relationships can become very one-sided, where you're either giving more than you're getting, or there's no give and take. You don't see a return in such a way that you're getting back anything. So start evaluating who are the people that pour back into you, and make sure that you spend time, that you carve out some opportunities to be with those people. The people who need you, the people who are placing demands on your social energy, will always be louder than the people who are just there to support you. And so you have to recognize that those people who are life-giving, they're not the ones putting demands and asks on you. They're not the ones calling you up asking for favors. They're the ones who are just kind of sitting in the background waiting for when you have time for them. Make time for them. Evaluate how to incorporate them into your life. And so some simple strategies for incorporating more social rest can be something like having a quick what's it chat with somebody who's life-giving to you, FaceTiming them, maybe even just having a quick text. I know sometimes for myself, when I feel as if I'm giving, and I'm never with the people who I enjoy most, it's helpful for me just to send a quick text and say, hey, just wanted to see what's going on in your life. Knowing you're a friend of mine makes me so happy. And that gets the conversation just started. And we just kind of have a quick chat. Sometimes it's just 5 minutes. Sometimes it ends up in, let's go out for coffee this evening or tomorrow or whatever. Just having some opportunities to connect with those people who you're thankful that are in your life, but you may not have as much time with. This also turns around to our own personal relationships. When we started looking at couples specifically and how couples experience emotional and social rest, because these two tend to go together, they both involve people to some degree. What we found is that oftentimes couples spend a lot of energy in the same, space together at home after work, and, they're together physically, but they weren't really getting the emotional and social rest that they needed. And one of the things that we had them start doing is, first of all, opening up opportunities for emotional rest within your home. Now, you can do this with your spouse as well as with your children, simply by starting to ask the question, how was your day? Where I live at, we ask this all the time. How are you doing? How's your day? How's it going? And honestly, we ask it with no desire for any reply whatsoever. It's just like saying hi. It's just the way that we kind of greet people. you can do that. That's fine, but don't do it at home. Because at home, you really actually care how those people are doing. And so when you first start this practice, asking someone, how is your day? They're going to say, it was good. It was fine. It was okay. Especially if you have teens, you're going to get a one-word answer. How to break this is actually just touch them. Put your hand on their shoulder, their arm, wherever it is that you can quickly, touch. The touch alone signifies intimacy, which then they're going to look at you. Because it's going to be like, well, why is this person touching me? They're going to then turn and look at you. And then you ask it again. No, really, I want to know how your day was. I have been amazed at how a simple question between people who love each other can make such a huge difference. Couples who have been spending a lot of time in the same space with each other, however, that time has been face to screen, face to kids, face to everything else but each other. When they are given opportunities to be face to face, intimacy grows and builds again. And so you want to start by being able to give the person that you love an opportunity for emotional rest. Now, the reason many of us don't do this is because we feel like emotional rest is trauma dumping. In other words, you had a horrific day at work and you want to tell your spouse about how horrible this day was, and you're going to give them all the graphic details, and you're going to tell them everything that happened, every sentence that somebody said. That can be a form of trauma dumping. You're basically trying to paint the picture of the experience you had, like a fiction novel, and bring them into the drama with you so that they can get riled up and mad with you. That is not emotional rest. That is a cop-out around emotional rest. Because what it does is it actually allows you to be the narrator of the story rather than actually entering into what your actual emotions are. So when you're practicing emotional rest, instead of actually trying to share all of the details of what happened, share how it made you feel. That is where the true emotional rest comes from. It's not what that colleague said to you and how they rolled their eyes and whatever else. What did that do inside of you? How did it make you feel? Did it make you feel insecure? Did it make you feel as if you were lesser than in some way? Did it make you feel incompetent? Let's get to the real emotions behind it, because that's when you actually start getting some healing, when you put voice to the things that are going on emotionally inside of you. Now, another thing that we found that helped quite a few couples is making sure that you do turn face to face. Now, I realize that many of us aren't this face to face, especially if you've been married for any length of time or in any kind of relationship for a long period of time. This is kind of like the puppy love stage, but at least be looking towards each other, because the research showed that majority of couples spent very little time actually looking at each other. They were always looking at or doing other things, multitasking in the midst of their relationships and in the midst of their conversations. And conversation and communication are two of the things that will quickly tear down any relationship if not done well. So, of these 7 types of rest, I want you to take a moment to just determine which type of rest are you most in need of. Which area is it that you feel like you are either not being intentional about doing restorative activities in, or that you need to spend more time doing activities in? And so that is our next polling question. And once we have about 70 or so percent, we can share the results. And so looks like we have, we have a good split. And it looks like the majority of you said mental rest, which statistically has been the case, ever since we started this research, has been mental rest tends to be at the number 1 or number 2 all the time. However, when COVID hit in 2020 and all of us went remote and everything kind of went crazy, sensory for a season jumped significantly high and was battling with mental rest for number 1. But mental rest has been statistically highest across the board. And then after that is emotional rest, which is not surprising because, as you can imagine, mental health in the US and in many countries is a major issue because we have trained ourselves not to really want to deal very much with our emotions because of fear of trauma dumping, because of fear of being authentic about what we're experiencing. People pleasing has a huge aspect of emotional rest deficits. So I want to make sure I hit on that as well, because that's another one where for many people, their emotional rest becomes very difficult because they don't have a lot of healthy personal boundaries. They don't really understand the power of a well-said no. And so they feel bad when they can't do things or meet requests that friends and families have placed before them. And so because of their lack of personal boundaries, they have a tendency to give yeses when they should give no's. So rather than give a reluctant yes, they should start giving a more truthful no to be able to get back more restorative time emotionally, because they're not honoring their own need for rest. So that's a huge one we've seen for a lot of people. And there's a couple of things before we go to questions I want to make sure that I hit on. One of them being is that when we talk about rest, I want to make sure that you continue to keep this thought process in the back of your mind. Rest is about restoration. So it is not simply about cessation. It's not just about stopping. It's about pouring back into the places that have been depleted. So it can be an active thing that you're doing. And so sometimes when we talk about these different types of rest, a question that I oftentimes get while you are putting your questions in the Q&A, if you have any that we can hit next, a common question I get is, well, I feel like I get rest most when I'm out jogging. How can that be? I'm jogging, I'm sweating, I'm tired, my heart rate's up to 150. How is that rest? Well, that's the thing. Each of these are exclusive of the other. So you can be physically doing something very taxing while experiencing rest in another area, which is often the case with jogging. Physically, you're not resting. Physically, you are expending energy. But while you are jogging, for some, that is the only time that their mind is able to mindfully focus its attention down on something like the cadence of your foot pace, as well as your breathing. So you're mentally doing a mindfulness activity of focusing on your breathing and your cadence while you're doing the jogging. And it's that time of mental focusing is when you're getting the mental rest. Some people get that when they're chopping wood, if you're living up north somewhere where it's snowing, or other activities like that are very repetitive. So differentiate these different types of rest, because you can be getting multiple types at one time. You can be active in one while getting rest in another. You don't have to be resting in all seven at the same time. So I'll open the floor back up, and Brittany, you're welcome to come back on and we can move over into Q&A. But before we do that, I do want to share with you the information about where all of this came from. This is all from my book, Sacred Rest: Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, Restore Your Sanity. And if you are someone who wants to go deeper into this and wants to kind of have a more clear idea about your specific rest deficit, we do have an assessment. It's a free assessment at restquiz.com, where you can determine which of the 7 types of rest you're most deficient in, as well as begin to determine your next steps, because you can't try to get all 7 of these at one time. Start with the area of your greatest deficit. Once you start pouring back into that area of depletion, you'll start feeling more energized, and then you can start layering on some other areas that may be deficient as well.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a few questions in the chat, so I can just sort of lead us through. Actually, multiple of them are about rumination. So one of them is any tips to stop ruminating, and another is how can we stop ruminating, which happens in hopes of solving a problem.
Yeah, so rumination, if you want to ruminate, you just don't want to ruminate at the wrong time. So rumination, not a bad thing if you're trying to study. You just don't want to do it right before going to bed. And so if you're ruminating, so I'll give an example. Sometimes if you are problem solving and you're laying down at night, it's like that's the first time your brain's had a chance to kind of silence itself enough to even really kind of look at the problem from a different light. So one of the things, as we mentioned, could be a brain dump. And with that, what you're doing is you're not saying you're trying to ignore what information is popping up. You're just putting it down in a way that's concrete so you can revisit it. And so whatever those thoughts are, whatever those strategies that pop up, and you're like, oh, that's a good idea. Well, 12 o'clock at night's not the best time to go processing that because you're needing that energy the next morning. Write it all out. You can dictate it if you prefer. I prefer you don't have your gadgets by your bed in the middle of the night, but I do have some personal coaching clients who that's how they function. So dictate it if you must or whatever on your phone, but then put it aside and recognize that you're going to be fresher and more able to fully process that the next morning when you're not in the middle of the night trying to go to sleep.
Great. And do you have any advice for retraining the brain in anyone who experiences a sudden decrease in sensory threshold, like due to a mental or physical illness? So a change in what they feel they were once able to handle.
For sensory input?
Sensory threshold, yeah.
Yeah, so that's very specific because that sometimes goes into we work with a lot of clients with ADHD and other and post-traumatic stress disorder and a whole lot of other things that can affect kind of your sensory ability. I think the thing to keep in mind is all of our sensory thresholds are taxed throughout the day. And so if your job requires a certain level of sensory input, you may have to downgrade the sensory inputs in your personal life. And I know that can seem a little bit unfair because it's like, oh, so I shouldn't watch as much TV or whatever because my job is kind of taxing me through this because it's so sensory rich. The thing is not that you can't watch too much TV. What type of TV are you watching? If there's certain activities, I'll give an example. For sometimes when we have someone who has a low seizure threshold, we don't put them in situations where they are flashing lights at a certain speed because we recognize that can actually potentially put them into a seizure. It's the very same thing if you have a low sensory threshold. I wouldn't put you in sensory rich situations. I wouldn't tell you, well, it's 4th of July, let's go do fireworks or let's go to a heavy metal concert. It's not that I'm trying to be unfair. It's a self-protection mechanism so that you don't then further kind of bring assault to an area that's already showing that it needs a reprieve.
Sure. That makes sense. And somebody asked what your favorite mental rest activities are.
I like meditative practices. And I specifically don't mention meditation during my presentations because it's got such a bad name. But meditation I put it to you this way. Meditation can look 1,000 different ways for 1,000 different people. And I think because we all think of it oftentimes, or many people, I should say, think of it oftentimes as doing hums or chants or some religious, ritual or something, that we've taken away the power of meditative practices. But meditative practices for me specifically deal with what are the things that allow my brain to focus on one thought. So oftentimes I'll pick like some kind of affirmative quote or like personal affirmation, or sometimes I'll just one specific word that I want to focus on. If I'm particularly stressed about something, especially, the news can be very distressful. Mm-hmm. It can look like we live in a world that just has no peace, no compassion, none of those good things that are wonderful. Sometimes my word for meditation is simply that, peace. Mm-hmm. I focus on the word. So every time my brain starts worrying about whatever, I focus on one word, peace. So I don't get worried about my child that's in college or my teen that's behind the wheel. There's a bazillion things you could actually get worried about. Finding how you meditate best, I think, can be very powerful, but it is very individualized. You have to figure out what actually helps you get to a place of focusing and mindfulness.
And someone actually asked something similar, or not similar, but sort of an add-on to that sort of meditation is usually touted as a stress reducer. Is it physical stress reduction, or do study shows that it also is mental or emotional rest? And I think what you've been saying sort of is that it can be mental and emotional rest, right? It's later on.
That's a great point, because the research that we're currently moving into and that we're doing with a lot of different corporations and agents, athletic agencies is what we're doing it with primarily, and military, is looking specifically at that neuropsychological component,
Mhm.
that the physical and the psychological definitely interact with each other and have an effect upon each other.
Sure.
So as you're improving kind of the neurological aspect of it, the psychological aspects of it, you're having a physical aspect of change that occurs in the body as well. You
Sure.
know, so many studies have shown that general reduction of our stress levels and cortisol levels improve things like blood pressure, includes things like diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, all of these things. It's that connection, particularly as an internist, is that connection that currently I'm most interested in. And how do we help build that into lifestyles so that people don't think they just have to go on a vacation or take some super long sabbatical to accomplish it? Because that's not realistic. I mean, I live in the real world where hospitals don't close. I work sometimes 50, 60 hours a week, if necessary, because of the way, COVID, we were working around the clock in medicine. So, it's one of those things where how can I restore in the middle of working in a stressful profession? So you can build restorative practices even into super busy days so that you have a work, rest, ebb and flow. And I'm not saying it's healthy to work 60 hours. Believe me, I wish that were different, but sometimes it is what it is. And so when we're being realistic, we then have to start determining, how do I build in restorative practices, even if I can't change the system that I'm within?
That's so important to remember too, because oftentimes you sort of feel like, well, I don't have time to take the vacation. And then, so that's that. So it's so important to sort of practice making the space for it. We can probably take one more question. There's actually one that's very specific about the amount of rest. When somebody says 7 to 8 hours of sleep, does that mean consecutively, or is it okay if you wake up in the middle of the night, use the bathroom, something like that, and you get 4 hours in one stint and 4 hours in the next?
Most of us can get up, go to the bathroom, get back in bed, and fall straight back into sleep. And so if you're able to do that, I consider that continuous, because the body has to do what the body has to do. So, and it will not allow you to stay asleep if you're about to wet the bed. It's programmed that it's going to wake you up. And so as long as you're able to fall back to sleep quickly, the problem I find, however, with a lot of patients is that they wake up to use the bathroom and that's it. It's like their ability to fall back asleep is completely gone. And so it takes another 30, 40 minutes to an hour to try to fall back asleep. That can be problematic because that means you're not quickly getting back into those stages of non-REM and REM sleep fast. You're basically starting the process all over again and not being able to quickly enter back into where you came out. And when that's the case, I usually recommend they start evaluating how they're drinking throughout the day. Get your fluids earlier in the day, particularly sometimes men, after they get past a certain age, the prostate has some changes that can make it difficult to go throughout a night without using the bathroom. Even a healthy prostate can do that. So just being aware, probably not a good idea to try to get all your liquids consumed after work. You're going to set yourself up for some disappointment with the sleeping through.
That makes sense. I think there are only a few questions that we're not going to have time to answer, unfortunately. But one question that I did see multiple times is whether or not people will be able to access this afterwards. And we will send the recording out to all of the attendees. It should come, I think, in a week. So you should receive an email from Twill with a recording, so you can rewatch everything that we've talked about today and have the access ongoing. But there's a lot of wonderful praise for you and in the chat and how much people enjoyed this and the takeaways.
Excellent. I'm glad it was helpful.
Thank you so much for doing this. This is wonderful.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.